Hey there and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Kaylee and I'm a beauty and fashion photographer based near Sydney, Australia. And on this channel, we talk about all things photography related. And in today's video, we're going to be discussing about whether you're over-retouching your images. This is a really tricky thing to know, especially if you're just starting out with retouching and especially portrait retouching. It can be really tricky to know the difference between something that has gone too far in the retouching process and something that looks a little bit more minimal. And it does take more of a trained eye to start to realize when things are overdone, especially when it comes to skin retouching. So if you've been watching my channel, you may have seen the video that I posted recently on one thing that photographers should stop doing to their images. And that one thing was to stop over retouching skin, because it's really becoming more of a movement these days, but also it's just something that can really lower the quality of your work as well. And I guess overall, we really want to stop that happening, that over retouched look from coming too much into your commercial work potentially, because a lot of clients these days are very against it. They don't want to see it. So this is one point that I made in the video, but in this video I didn't really provide any examples of over retouched work, and this was more from my fear of singling out any one particular photographer or retoucher. I didn't want to do that, but I really did come to the conclusion that I could do this myself. I could actually do some over retouching on my own images to show you from a professional's point of view what is going too far and what is kind of the ideal range for retouching, especially with skin. I actually had a viewer bring up a really interesting point, and one thing that I want to make sure that I do cover in this video, and they really asked for a professional's point of view on this. Not so much showing the difference between really blurred skin, which I think we can all tell the difference between an Instagram filter kind of style of retouching and what good retouching looks like, but it's really looking at those finer details from a professional's point of view in terms of what is going too far. What kind of mistakes do professionals make on a regular basis when it comes to retouching skin, and when do you know that it's gone too far? So I really want to show these examples today to you and actually give you more of a visual on what this looks like and what you may be best to avoid. So as a disclaimer, this is based on my experience as a beauty and fashion commercial photographer, and I have had about 10 years experience with doing this now. And we also need to take into consideration that this isn't completely cut and dry what we're going to talk about today. There is a certain level of artistic freedom that comes along with retouching, and depending on the style of photo shoot you're going to be working on, it may be okay that you tend to go over the top a little bit. Or for example, if you've got a different effect on the images, like a glow effect, it may look a little bit overdone to the eye, but it works because that's the style of the image that you're going for. So there's different levels of creativity that we also need to allow for when it comes to this. But in general, I'm going to talk about today and show you today what is usually considered going too far with skin retouching. So without any further rambling, let's get straight into the video. Okay, so now we're in Photoshop. We are here with our original image. The only adjustments that I've made to it have just been through Camera Raw, and I've processed this straight through Adobe Bridge in this instance just to get it into Photoshop and really look at retouching the skin and showing you guys what may be a little bit overdone in my personal opinion. Now, as I always say, I feel like this can be a bit subjective in terms of what is overdone with skin retouching. It really does depend on the project that you're working on. So if you're working on something that's commercial, you might have a client that wants the skin to be a little bit more overdone in some ways or a little bit more smoother, but most of the time, even commercial clients these days will want you to have a very natural appearance with the skin texture. And even with editorials, sometimes you can push it a little bit further in some instances, but overall, you really need to look at keeping the natural skin texture intact. So I just want to go through a few main points with this that I feel that sometimes photographers do miss when they're retouching skin, especially when they're first starting out. But even for those of us that have been retouching for a long time, I can tell you now that I still make these mistakes and I still go too far, and I really need to incorporate having quite a lot of breaks into my retouching process, because I feel that that helps me to come back to my screen with fresh eyes and actually realizing what I've done to the image and what I've done potentially wrong. So looking at this particular image, I'm just going to go through a few things that I would really look at removing, and my approach to this would be to obviously keep as much of this texture in the image as possible. This was shot in natural light as well, so there is a bit of a softness that is going into the image. We don't have a lot of skin texture to work with as opposed to some of my images that may be taken with studio lighting. So obviously I do want to remove just a couple of these small blemishes around. I want to use dodge and burn to kind of even out just certain sections of the skin tone as I usually would. So just some little shadows under here that are being caused by the lighting, and just some other areas maybe around the blemishes and just a little bit under the eyes. But overall, I'm not going to be doing too much to this image. I am going to be going through step by step though some of the mistakes that a lot of photographers are making when they're over retouching their images and how I believe that this actually occurs. So first off, we're going to be working on the skin tone, and I'm going to go through a couple of things that I see far too often being done to the skin tone that ends up making it look quite overdone. So first off, we're going to go through the mistakes, and then I'm going to do my own personal approach to it instead. So first off, one of the things that I find far too often is zooming in too close. And some people, I kid you not, will be this close into an image when they're retouching. And I've made this mistake before, but even this far in, to me, can be very, very close in for dodging and burning in particular. So I do find that most of the retouching mistakes are not necessarily made with the healing tools. And that's the first step in my process. It's to create a new blank layer, call it healing, and then to use the healing brush tool or the spot healing brush tool from time to time to actually start removing some of these blemishes. So I'd hold down Alt on the keyboard or Option for a Mac, and then just start to patch these little bumps that I see around. So that's not necessarily where I feel like a lot of photographers or retouchers go wrong when they're retouching, or when their retouching work can look a little bit overdone. So this is kind of like the easy part, I guess, of the image. And really, I think a lot of people can do this quite well, but I am just going to go through this quickly before we even start with dodge and burn, just so you guys get a good overview of the whole process that I do. And I'm going to just speed through this process as well, because then you don't have to sit through about 20 minutes of me retouching these little elements out. So as I said, I'm just doing this really basic little things, small hairs, some of the bumps, just to remove them from the image. And then we'll start on some of the dodge and burn mistakes that I see often. Okay, so as I said, I've just removed a lot of those small little blemishes or small spots on the skin. So just turning that layer on and off, you can see that difference there. I'm not going to go too much further with the healing brush tool, because I like to do the bulk of my retouching with dodge and burn on the skin, and I like to keep as much texture as possible. So I don't want to go too far with this. Sometimes one thing I did forget to mention that a lot of people do wrong with the healing brush tool and with that first step is they actually remove a lot of these elements. So such as the freckles, the moles, anything that kind of adds that little bit of character to someone's face, they'll go ahead and remove all of them. So I'm actually just going to remove everything that I can kind of see like that at the moment. So I've just removed Josephina's moles and freckles, and I'm actually going to go quickly back to the snapshot that I just took beforehand and show you guys a before and after. So that's the before, and then that's the after. Can you see how having the freckles and the moles in there really do give her face that character? Of course, they're a natural appearing element on the face, but I personally like to leave them intact because I think that sometimes it adds something a little bit extra to the photo. And as I said, a lot of people and a lot of clients will not want you retouching out that kind of thing these days. I don't personally feel like there's a need to do it. A lot of people do, but again, it just kind of adds to that sort of overdone effect that can appear. So I'm going to keep it as that, and we're actually going to go on to using dodge and burn at the moment. So of course, if you've watched my channel before, you've probably seen a lot of tutorials from me on dodge and burn. So definitely feel free to go check them out if you haven't already. Creating my dodge and burn layers, I usually do 2 curves adjustment layers. So the dodge layer with the line brought up, and then making sure our layer mask is selected to hold down Control and I to invert, and that will be Command I for a Mac. And we're just going to rename that to dodge. We're going to do the same thing again with another curves adjustment layer, but bringing the line down this time to make it dark. Again, making sure the layer mask is selected, Control I to invert, and then we'll rename this to burn. So I usually like to start on my dodge layer. And what I'm actually going to show you guys first is a couple of mistakes that I find that happen way too often. So again, we're going to be zooming in really close to do this dodging and burning process. And I'm going to show you why this is not necessarily a good idea. So going to our brush tool on the side here, I usually have my settings at 0% hardness. Usually the brush size is quite a bit smaller. We can adjust that later. Opacity is at 100%, flow is at 1%. And then also because I'm using a graphics tablet, I go to the brush settings, ensure that transfer is checked, and that pen pressure is selected under the drop-down menu underneath opacity, jitter, and control. So usually the way that I would start dodging and burning is by sort of filling in any areas that are not as even. So let's just say we want to even out this texture in the skin a little bit more. Just in this lighter section here, so that's why we're using dodge on some of these darker little crevices in the skin to even it out. So if I turn that on and off, you can see that that really helps to even out the skin. But what we're actually doing by doing this really close up, we are removing a lot of the skin texture and really sort of having it fade into nothing, which is not a good idea. And this is, I think, where a lot of people do tend to go a bit wrong with dodge and burn. And they'll end up spending 6 hours on an image doing this to the skin. But by the end of it, the skin texture is mostly gone, and a lot of the time that's not what we want. So I'm just going to continue filling this in around the pores and these darker sections, again, before, after. And I'll show you what this is going to look like when we zoom out. Now I'm just going ahead and burning some of those like highlights just to blend it in, or just to sort of merge it all together. Just kind of helps flatten the image, which is actually something we don't really necessarily want in this section of the skin. But just to give you an idea of what quite often goes wrong with dodge and burn, I'm just going to do this. So you can kind of see that it looks good close up. And I think that this is the issue, is that a lot of people work so close up like this and the texture is looking pretty good and the skin is looking pretty good. But the problem is that when we zoom out, you won't be able to see any of that skin texture because we really have removed a really large bulk of it. So I am going to zoom out in just a second. So I'm going to zoom out now. And you can see that there's not much skin texture, as I said. When you're zooming out, we don't really have too much to work with. It looks quite flat. There's not much natural highlight or midtone left from the original image now. And we've kind of removed a lot of that skin texture that will show up from a distance. So taking a snapshot, I'm going to go back to the before. And you can almost say that the before looks better because it's still got that kind of nice crease of the eye and you can sort of see that it looks natural. But doing dodge and burn like this across the entire skin tone is really going to make it look quite flat and a little bit on the plastic side. There's not going to be much definition to the shadows and highlights, and even if you add them back in with a bit of contouring, it's going to look very flat. So to me, this is what I would consider starting to get overdone with the retouching. And if you did that, as I said, across the entire face, I feel that it would be really reaching that level of the fact that it looks too soft and it looks not textured enough. So instead, what I would do in this instance is I wouldn't be so close up doing dodge and burn like this. I'd be zooming back, and let's reset these dodge and burn layers so I can start again. And now what I would do instead is I'd zoom out a little bit further. You can, of course, zoom into your images if you want to do any cleaning for makeup fallout and things like that. Of course, that's fine to zoom in for. But for dodge and burn in particular, I just find it's better to get a better overall view of the image so you can see that skin texture and whether it's still coming through or not. So instead, how I would approach this is I really wouldn't touch all of this area at all. I think this sort of section's looking fine. So for the most part, we're just going to work on this bit here and just under this area as well, just in some small sections. So I'm not going to use a really tiny brush, but also I've got to say as well, we need to make sure that white is selected when we're using an inverted mask with our adjustment layers. So I'm just going to start painting just in any areas that, yeah, it does look a little bit patchy with the highlight and the way that the light's hitting the face. So just under here, it's a bit dark. So I'm just going to brighten it up a little bit, but you can see how I'm not going into every little crevice. I'm just doing a bit of lightening overall on that section, not every single little pore. So I use a little bit of dodge and burn, but mainly dodge on this area because it is already highlighted. We don't want to be using too much burn. It is going to make the highlight look very flat. So I'm just going into some of these little areas here. I'm going to switch over to burn, and I'm just going to kind of make sure that we're blending into the mid-tone here. So everything looks kind of relatively smooth, but not too smooth. It's hard to say exactly where to dodge and burn. I always find it very difficult to explain this to a lot of students as well, but it's something that you do get used to picking up on the more that you go along with this particular method of retouching. So I personally feel like that's starting to look a bit better. Let's zoom out a little bit, and you can see that we've still got quite a bit of texture here. So actually, I'd probably not go too much further than that. If anything, I'd just blend this section just a little bit more here with the burn tool. Just making sure that kind of looks as smooth as possible. Maybe getting the dodge again and just extending the lighter mid-tone out a bit more there. So I always find it very helpful to zoom out sometimes while I'm doing even my local dodging and burning, just to kind of make sure I'm on the right track with everything. But I'd probably not go much further than that. And then I would start to do the same sort of process around the skin. So I'd start probably moving out onto this side with the burn tool, just kind of filling in some of these shadowed areas, making that look a little bit smoother. But again, I'm not zoomed in very far. I'm not using a very tiny brush. I'm not doing every pore. I want this to have a very natural effect in the image overall. So we're really just doing a very natural job of this cheek right now. And for under the eye, I'd only just brighten it slightly. This is another area where a lot of people, unfortunately, probably don't do a great job, is just under the eye. They do too much. But even on this side, I'm just going to brighten this little section here. I'm not going to get rid of all this texture. This is really adding character to the face and a natural element as well. So you can see that even on this side, I'm not doing too much. It's just really touching up certain areas. I feel like there's other methods you can use after dodge and burn as well, like the clone stamp tool and a very low opacity and flow to make some of the areas with a lot of texture a little bit less apparent. But let's just go back to an overall view. I'm going to take a snapshot and show you the before of when I was retouching very close in with dodge and burn. So that was before with the dodging and burning on the cheek. And then that's the after with just doing it a little bit further out. So you can see that there's a little bit more texture there. It's not as glowy and kind of has that white washed out effect on the skin too if you add too much dodging. But this is just looking a little bit better, especially in this area. We've left a little bit more natural effect under the eye. It can be hard to see, but let me just zoom in a little bit further so you can see it a bit better. So before, this is just starting to get a little bit too bright, a little bit too mottled even on the skin over here. But here we've got a little bit more of a natural effect. You're keeping the eye intact. If you want to remove any of these areas, I find it best to use the healing brush tool to do this. So going back to the healing layer, healing brush tool, and then just using a small brush to run that over. And then moving that over like that, removing any fallout and that sort of thing with the healing brush tool. So you can see that that's still from a distance retaining a lot of texture, and this is just the way that I prefer to retouch. I feel like it's got a lot better depth than working so close up to the skin texture, and if I did this across the entire skin, you would really notice the difference on how that's going to look. The second part of this that I really wanted to go into that a lot of photographers do tend to do when dodging and burning, and it tends to make an image look a little bit overdone, is that they actually remove the wrong sorts of shadows in an image, or they add them in. So one thing I find, especially with contouring, a lot of the time with dodge and burn, people do tend to go quite overboard with this. So say if I went to the burn layer, I got my brush and I wanted to deepen this shadow a little bit on the side here. But a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll deepen it, but then they'll start to bring the shadow right out or go really heavy with it in the creases there. So they might even put a shadow on this side of the image where there is technically no shadow. And then bring it the whole way around. And then using dodge, let's just remove this shadow here, which I actually would do. I would use dodge to remove that little shadow there. But you can see how this is starting to look very glowy, and it's starting to kind of have a bit of a fake kind of looking effect. That is not how I would contour an image. So what I do in this instance instead is that I'd obviously run the brush just over this area where it is a bit darker. And just along the jawline, but only along those areas where there's already a shadow. So again, what a lot of people do is they'll go to the dodge layer, for example, they'll get their brush and they'll remove this entire shadow here and make it look like there was no shadow there to begin with, which sometimes just does not work, unfortunately, for a lot of images. And you'll start to notice the lighting looking of a poor quality almost in the image. So say they wanted all of this lightened up. And you start to notice a lot of color disparity as well, the more that you do dodging and burning. A lot of the time people use dodging too much and not enough of the burn tool. And they'll only use dodge, which doesn't always work, unfortunately. It sort of ends up making the image look quite washed out and not a lot of depth. So if you were to dodge the entire thing, you'd probably end up having something looking like this, where you've got shadows that have been removed, which really removes that depth from the photo. So that's one thing to be really aware of when you are retouching. You don't want to have that happening to the images where you've got kind of those natural shadows and you really want them to stay intact. You want to have that nice depth with however you've lit the image in the first place, and you want to retain that. I think that's one of the main things to remember as well when you're dodging and burning. So there's really the two parts, like I said, zooming in too close, going a little bit too far with the retouching here. So going back to what we were doing before, you can see there's kind of like a ghostly film that's starting to come up on the highlight here. A lot of people will go even further. So they'll have their dodge layer, a small brush size, and then they'll make their flow very high compared to the 1% that I usually work with. And then they'll really lighten up these little crevices even more. And to the point where there's virtually no skin texture left over at all. So you can see the more that I'm adding this dodge, the more that there's just not any skin texture kind of being left over, but especially from a distance. You can see that that's starting to look really flat now, as opposed to what we were just doing before, where we just did a more of a minimal retouch here. Another element to this before I move on to frequency separation and how I believe that's taken a bit too far as well, is that the eyes are brightened too much. Now, I'm all for brightening eyes with using dodge. I think it's a really great way to do it. And I always like doing it on a really low flow percentage and really just brightening the sclera a little bit, which is the whites of the eyes, and then just very gently running the brush over the iris as well. They don't need to be brightened too much a lot of the time. You can use a bit of burning as well to kind of really highlight and sculpt the iris section. But too many people, I think, take this too far, where they continuously brighten the iris area to the point where the eyes start to look very doll-like and they start to look very fake. And I've found that the more I do this and the more that I edit the eyes, the more that I prefer how they originally looked, because it starts to really add this unnatural effect, which quite a lot of clients really don't like in a lot of the images that you'll send them if you're a professional working photographer or retoucher. When it gets to this point, it's just too overdone. It starts to look a little bit vampire looking, and unfortunately, this is where it starts to get a little bit overdone for me. So I'd really pare that back to something that's just a little bit more like just at this section of the iris, not usually the whole way around, just wherever the light's already hitting it, and a little bit on the whites of the eyes. And that's kind of as far as I'd go with brightening them a lot of the time. I find that really, if you want to highlight the eyes, the best way to do it sometimes is in camera and using a reflector to kind of bounce the light back in a little bit more. Okay, so let's move on to frequency separation now. So I'm going to add my frequency separation action here. And we're going back to the original image to do this as well. So one thing that I do find happens with frequency separation all too much is people just go a little bit too far with the color layer in particular. Sometimes the adjustment layer as well. Sometimes people will use a paintbrush to add color or to add a softness to the image, which just goes too far. But overall, if you're not really sure how frequency separation works, I do have other tutorials on my channel of how it does work. I don't tend to use this technique a lot, but I figured I would include that in this tutorial, as a lot of you do use this for fashion imagery or for weddings and that sort of thing. So I'm going to show you what I would consider probably to be too far at the moment. So if we go to color layer, I usually drag that into the new layer button and make a duplicate of it, just so we're not working directly on that. And usually a lot of people will like to use the healing brush tool. So if we hide the texture layer, you'll be able to see what we're really working on with the color copy layer. And again, a lot of people will just kind of really remove everything on this layer until there's virtually no little bits of texture, which they kind of think is okay to do because we've got the top texture layer here. But unfortunately, it's not, and it does remove that underlying depth to the texture a lot of the time. So if we just kind of sit here and remove a lot of that texture that you can see, which I think a lot of people do think that they're supposed to do with frequency separation on the color layer, we're going to see how that really affects everything once we add the texture layer back. And so we've pretty much removed a lot of the texture there, as you can see. So let's add back in that texture layer on top. And you can already see that it's really lost the depth. It's almost kind of having that same effect as if we're zooming in really close with the dodge tool and doing every little crevice. We've removed a lot of the depth from the texture of the skin, and this is where it starts to go too far with frequency separation. And unfortunately, a lot of people do go too far with this particular method. A lot of the time, it's one that you do need to be quite careful with. Because you do have the texture layer, that is a really good thing. So you can work on the color copy layer mainly to do a lot of your adjustments, but I definitely would prefer to do them in a more measured way if I'm looking at keeping that natural effect. So just because you've got the texture layer up here doesn't mean that it's going to keep all the texture you need from the image. So let's go back again and reset those layers. Again, I'm going to drag this into the new layer button, create myself a color copy, and we're going to take an approach that I would prefer to take with this. So again, this would work like my healing layer in the previous method with dodge and burn. I would use the healing brush tool, and I really would start to remove some of those little bumps. A lot of people actually like to remove the texture layer while they're working on the color copy. You don't actually need to. You can keep the texture layer intact and really get a good idea of how much texture you're removing from the image. If you prefer though, you can turn that layer off just while you're doing this. But I would be just looking at those main big bits of texture that I'd want to remove there, and just kind of doing it that way. So you're really not removing a lot of the texture from the top. So you are still removing some of those little blemishes, but luckily you're not kind of destroying the texture in the process. So that is the before, and then that is the after. So it's another really good way to remove those blemishes by using this particular layer. If you're wanting to soften the texture or to even out the texture a little bit more, the best way usually to do this is by going to the adjustments layer here. You can then get a paintbrush tool. I tend to have the same settings as how I use it for dodge and burn. So 100% opacity, 1% flow, and then brush settings set to transfer, and then pen pressure. And then I would hold down Alt on the keyboard or Option for a Mac, And I would choose a skin color kind of similar to the area I'm working on. So let's just choose this highlight color here to start with. And then I would just really gently paint in between the frequencies. And this helps to soften the texture a bit. So you can see what I've done by just turning that on and off. And this is definitely a much quicker way of doing things than dodge and burn a lot of the time. Although I definitely wouldn't be opposed to using both techniques on the same image. So you can make the brush a bit smaller, kind of color in those little bits there with the lighter color just to kind of soften that. Again, turning that on and off, you can see it's just kind of making that a little bit. I'm just going to sample from this section now and then kind of drag that in a little bit further. You really do need to be careful with frequency separation from having things go too soft, and keep sampling different colors so you're getting good variation while retouching the skin as well. So let's just do a quick before and after on what we've done there. So before, after. So you can see that that looks a lot better than what we had before, and it is getting that really natural effect in there. If you want to keep going back to the color copy layer, you can use the healing brush tool to remove any of those little extra bumps and that you think are maybe a little bit distracting. And I don't tend to work on the texture layer much, just mainly on the color copy layer for most of the adjustments that I'm going to make. So just going over those little bumps there and bringing down a little bit more of that texture. So again, you can go to the adjustments layer, use the brush tool and hold down Alt to select colors. And then just kind of paint where you feel there might need to be a little bit more evenness on the skin tone. So it kind of works in a similar way like this technique here, just a bit like dodge and burn, except you're using colors over light and shadow necessarily. You can really use varying sizes of your brush to kind of bring a good amount of color variation and texture variation of the skin. So again, let's do a quick before and after of that approach. So before and then after. And again, if I zoom out, I can see that I've probably gone even a little bit far with that. You can actually just adjust the fill of that so you can get a little bit more texture back if you want. So just turning that layer on and off, you can see how that's made a difference. So guys, those are the main few points that I really wanted to discuss when over retouching images today. I really wanted to do this from a professional's point of view because I feel like these are mistakes that quite often we make as professionals, and sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing these things. But I have sometimes wondered as well, when I've finished an image, what have I done wrong? I know there's something wrong or something off about this image, but I don't know why, and I don't know what I've done to achieve that effect. So hopefully if you do find yourself making any of these mistakes, some of them are highlighted in this video today, and hopefully some of these make sense to you as to why they are not always the best option and why maybe taking a different approach is preferred. Alright guys, so if you've got any questions about today's video, feel free to put them in the comment section below. I'd be really happy to answer any of them, and I really want to know what issues you really do come across when it comes to retouching and particularly skin. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed to this channel already, make sure that you hit the subscribe button because I'll be posting a lot more in future. And also just a little bit of a shameless plug that I do have retouching courses through Domestika and through my own Teachable website on beauty retouching, and also retouching for a diverse range of skin tones. So if you're interested in checking either of those courses out, make sure you follow the links in my description box below. And I also have one-on-one coaching available as well. So if you're looking for a little bit more in-depth knowledge on a particular subject when it comes to your photography business, you can go and check out the link for my coaching sessions down in the description box below. But thank you guys so much for watching this video again, and I'll see you in the next one.